Richard, thank you so much for serving in this capacity for our inaugural class of SPR scholars who were really impressive applicants. We had an amazing pool of applicants and we were able to offer participation to 11 of them. They've all have secured mentors, some of them secondary mentors. So we have some mentors, some individuals have one mentor, some have two mentors on this call, and we really appreciate everyone taking their time to be here today to learn from one another and to really formally launch this program that we hope will continue over many years for training the next generation of prevention scientists. And with that, I'd like to welcome our speaker, mentoring guru, expert, Richard Reddick, who has come highly recommended in the field because of his amazing work around cross-cultural mentoring or mentoring across difference, has published extensively in this field and is just an altogether wealth of information and joy. So we look forward to you sharing your time with and expertise with us today.
Let me turn my mic on. Thanks so much, Carrie and Jennifer, and thank you both for just being so supportive and helpful shaping this. And I'm really looking forward to working with this group. And I also want to say congratulations to the early career prevention scientist. What are you all called? Cohort, superstars. It's really great to sort of be in your company and just to know. Some of you I actually do know from reputation. Some of the mentors I know as well. So I just think this is going to be a fantastic group to work with. So I'm looking forward to presenting. So first of all, good to see everybody. Apologies in advance for my technological failures. They will in fact happen. I keep on saying that, hoping that one day it'll go smoothly. But nevertheless, I just dropped a little note in there, and I'll go ahead and put my slides up, and this will be the first test of my abilities. We'll see if it works. Let's see. And oddly enough, as Carrie's done that nice introduction, I actually lost my screen. I could not find it. I have 3 monitors going and it disappeared, but I found it again. So I think you can see it, and I'm gonna actually go ahead and pull up my various screens because I can't see you right now. I have not figured out how we make this whole thing work so we can see, I can see your pictures and I can see everything like that. I'm working on that. So let's see.
Well, we can see you and your slides, so that's good.
Great, great. I can't see you. Okay, we'll have to just power through. Anyway, so here we are. So I'm Rich Reddick, as you saw, he, him, his, and my pronouns. Those are all of my things I do at UT Austin. What I think is pretty funny is I probably have the longest signature on campus. But anyway, it's great to be here and I'm excited to do this work. Let's see. So I dropped in the chat if people were familiar with Mentimeter, and some people are, but if you're not, it's really cool. If you have a cell phone or another laptop or even your computer using right now, it's going to allow us to do some interactive pieces in real time, which I think is pretty cool. And if you don't use it in your own classes, presentations, it's really cool and easy to use. So basically, if you have a cell phone, if you can queue it up to menti.com, when the slides come up that are interactive, there'll be a 6-digit code to put in. You just punch it in, and then you can actually respond to it. And it's anonymous, so you can feel free to say anything you want. I won't know who said it. You certainly can say I said it, but that won't be monitored in any way. Yeah. So just, gosh, I really wish I could see you all. Anyway, we'll persevere. Okay. Let me do this. You all can still see it full screen, right?
Rich, is your screen still, is your Zoom screen set for full screen? Because that might be part of the issue.
It was, I just took it off, and now I have a chat box, I have a participant box, but I can't see you. But I'll be fine.
Okay.
Nobody grimace, or if anybody's like grimacing, I won't be able to see, which is probably a good thing, right? And Erica, the code will come up when I get to the actual slide, so it's not up yet, just so you can be ready for it. So you're all good. Okay, we're going to start with a lead acknowledgement here in Austin. I'll talk about the evolution of mentoring research, my research agenda, We'll define mentoring, which is actually a challenge. That's one of the biggest challenges in mentoring research, is what is actually mentoring. Then I'm going to invite you all to be part of a interactive piece where we just sort of talk about what we believe is good mentoring, or what a good mentor is. I'll share some best practices from the work I've done in literature. And we'll walk through some expectations, norms, accountability, and goal setting pieces. And of course, the importance of reciprocity. I'm going to preview our next meeting about mentoring across difference a little bit, just not a whole lot, but just at least a mention of it, because it feels like I should be talking about that on some level, and introduce some tools that can help. And then we'll do an interactive piece again, and then we'll have a discussion. So if that sounds good to folks, we'll get started with that. Okay, so land acknowledgements. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these, and I'm really excited because here at UT Austin, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Department has a program has put together an acknowledgement, and we've been using as much as possible. So even though this is happening virtually, I think this is important to do anyway. So I want to acknowledge that we are meeting on Indigenous land. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the Carrizo and Comecrudo, Cohotecan, Caddo, Tonkawa, Comanche, Lipan Apache, Alabama Coshada, Kickapoo, Tigua Pueblo, and all the American Indian and Indigenous peoples and communities who have been and have become part of these lands and territories in Texas here on Turtle Island. I was at another meeting recently where folks introduced themselves using a land acknowledgement, which is really cool. But anyway, that's what we have here at Austin. I just want to make sure I had a chance to share that with you all. Thanks, Kevin. So something you do not know about me yet, I don't think, is that I am in fact a Jeopardy champion. So I have to start this with a quiz. And because I can't see you, I have to look at the chat for this. So the question is, what do these words have in common? Martinet, maverick, guillotine, mesmerize, braille, watt, sandwich, bowdlerize, spoonerism, and mentor. We can start the Jeopardy music right now too. You can also say you have no idea if you don't. I hear a thoughtful pause there. No guesses.
Last names?
Okay, I don't know who that was, but yes, you're exactly
Flavio.
right. Flavio, perfect. So yes, these are all words derived from people's last names. And the one I always think gives away is Louis Braille, right? And yes, Bonnie, you're right. There are a lot of them are French, but these are all words derived from somebody's name. You're probably saying, well, who the hell is mentor? So those of you who are classics fans, the Odyssey, the gentleman who was left when Odysseus leaves on the Odyssey, he leaves his son behind and asks his buddy, Mentor, to watch him. So that's where the term comes from. And in fact, there was a 1700s book written about the chronicles of Telemachus, and he talks about mentor in that book. So that's kind of where the word came from. So just, if you want to, be at a pub quiz at some point in time, you can drop that in there and look really, really intelligent. So that's what those words have in common. So here's the first Menti. So we'll see how you all use this. So go to menti.com, and the code is 320818. And the question I have for you is, what makes a good mentor? You'll have an option of putting 3 words in, and it's going to create in real time a word cloud. So feel free to drop in any 3 words that would describe to you a good mentor. And as you're doing this, I'm going to really figure out why I can't see you all. Oh, there you are. I can see you now. I love that it kind of does it in real time. And as you can see, you can kind of see the words that come up more often than not in frequency. So as you're doing this, I'm just going to sort of comment on what I see. Supportive is the biggest one so far. Kindness I see as well. Communicative, knowledgeable, listener, patient. Yes, remember that. Knowledgeable, absolutely. Invested, caring. I see honest there too. That's another important one. So the cool thing about this is as you're doing this, I'm going to actually be able to send this to you. So you'll be able to see what people said as we're responding. I'm going to do some quick in vivo coding right here. And I think we've got a number of terms that seem to relate to things like honesty. We have honesty, we have compassion. Let's see what else we have. See also some words relating to listening, listener, guidance, listening, listen, that kind of thing. So yeah, this is really cool to see you all respond this way. And I'm glad to say, I don't see anything that makes me say, oh my gosh, we're really way off. So I think you're all in the universe of understanding mentoring already. So I'll just go ahead and give you some the terms from the literature. So let me talk a little bit about the evolution of mentoring research as I've engaged with it. So one of the first volumes that came out was Dan Levinson's Seasons of a Man's Life. Yes, Man's Life in '78. And he talked about adult development and particularly about how at a certain point in the careers of men, they tended to get to a point where they realized, excuse me, that they were not going to be the president or the CEO or the leader of the organization. And so they kind of turned around and looked at who was coming behind them to support them. And he talked about the roles of teacher, sponsor, counselor, and exemplar. Sharon Merriam is one of the first people who really engaged in this work, I think intently, did a piece called Mentors and Proteges, looking at the literature and said, as we say to this present day, you know, we need to clarify and define what we mean by mentoring, because at this point in time, it's kind of popping up everywhere. In the upper left-hand corner, there's a picture of Kathy Cram, who's a wonderful resource, and I've used her work for many years now. And Kathy was really the first person to put together this definitive book, Mentoring at Work. All the mentoring folks have read this book. And what Kathy really did was look at the fact that so many organizations, especially corporations, had invested in hiring women in the 60s and the 70s, but had not seen these women move to the highest levels in the organization. And so she defined developmental relationships. And so we talk about mentoring. Mentoring is kind of the apex of developmental relationships. She also parsed out the different types. So there's role modeling. You're probably familiar with that, which means that you find somebody in your field or in your specialty who you admire from afar. You don't necessarily know that person. You could know them, but not necessarily, but you're just kind of emulating and sort of following their footsteps. Sponsorship is more of the instrumental aspect, which is the idea that I'm going to teach you how to do something. You know, how to manage people, how to run a budget, that kind of thing. So I'm invested in that level, helping you in your job. And Kathy argues that mentorship is the bonding of both instrumental aspects, so showing you how to do something and succeed, and also the psychosocial. How do you navigate the institutional context? How are you as a person is really important. So by definition, mentoring is an intimate relationship. And so people will often come to me and say, hey, Rich, we've got this mentoring program at my job, and they'll explain it to me. And I'm like, that doesn't sound like mentoring. It sounds like a sponsorship or coaching model you have. But mentorship actually goes beyond just the instrumental that happens in the workplace. It's actually career development, work-life balance. Those are parts of the aspect. So a mentor asks how your weekend was. A mentor cares about how things are happening with you in your career. A mentor probably transcends the workplace or the situational environment you're in. You're connected in a deeper way. And my own engagement comes really from the work on cross-race mentoring that David Thomas did and Stacy Blake Beard, and she's in the bottom right-hand corner. She was my initial doctoral advisor when I was in graduate school, and we're still quite close. And what David and Stacy and Audrey did was basically say, these models are interesting, but they don't tend to really center race or consider race really. They were kind of race mute, if you will. And they expanded to say that this mentoring dynamic really includes organizational culture. relationships characteristics, interaction strategies, interactions types, and mentoring outcomes. So one of the critiques of the mentoring literature is it tended to be sort of very white-centric. It didn't really talk about difference a whole heck of a lot. In the more recent years, folks have been thinking much more about difference. That ties to something I work with, which is this concept of cultural taxation, which is folks of color, queer folks, women, people with disabilities, people who hold those identities that are historically marginalized are often the ones who are tapped to do a lot of this work, including the mentoring work. And because mentoring is so intensive, it's often work that is sometimes, I wouldn't say burdensome, because people typically go in these relationships willingly, but it is an extra thing that people do. And it also means that sometimes majority colleagues kind of opt out of the work. So we can talk more about that as we get into our discussion. So what have I been doing? And so of course I'm on the very end of that picture in the upper left back. And those are a group of my advisees. We were at a Black Faculty Staff Association, and all of those students are my former students. Yep, they're all former students now. They've all graduated. So those doctors and masters students, they're all my folks. And many of them worked on these projects with me. So my initial work was on Black faculty mentoring with Black students. And you all should know that my advisor was an economist, and you'll probably say, wait a minute, you're a qualitative phenomenological researcher working with an economist. Yes. And Bridget told me, this is a great project, Rich, but you need to do something comparative. So compare Black faculty to another population. And I was not happy about that. I walked out of the meeting realizing I had to double my sample because of what she had said. But that was really fortuitous, because I've actually written, I think, much more on the white faculty cross-racial mentoring aspects. It's really interesting to figure out why people have engaged in mentoring across race. I've also been involved with my colleague, Michelle Young, on research on mentoring graduate students of color. It's really fascinating to sort of think about how this one part of development has been often overlooked. And oftentimes when you talk to grad students of color, they will tell you, this is the place where I really feel I need the most support. I had an opportunity to work with a colleague of mine, Rick Turwitz at UT, on a program that he put together that basically has graduate students mentoring undergraduate students who are historically marginalized to graduate school. That was a lot of fun to do that work. And the bottom right-hand corner is, I'm proud to say this, Dr. Victoria Black. She just graduated, did a TED Talk on a concept that I've been working on called mentorability, which is how do we prepare and support mentees or proteges in the mentoring experience? Because one thing that's happened a lot, and this is probably true of folks in this room, you've probably been assigned a mentor, at work, in your department, in the college, and you often don't know how to use that person exactly. So my point is, mentorability is really focusing on the experiences of the mentees and helping them understand how to access the mentor. And honestly, the older and more experience you get, the more expertise you have in this area. But I'm really concerned about, for instance, undergraduate students, many of whom are first generation, who are in those contexts and they don't know how to use, because nobody's ever told them, this is how you use a mentor, that kind of thing. So that's what's going on right now with me. So let's look at the APA definition, which is a pretty strong definition, I think. And it basically says a mentor is individual expertise who can help develop the career of a mentee. The mentor has two primary functions. That's the Kathy Cram issue. The career-related function, which is helping people instrumentally navigate a space, and the psychosocial function, which is giving the mentor the role of role model and support system. And both functions are explicit and implicit lessons related to professional development and work-life balance. I think especially for faculty members, that's something that we have to really be cognizant of, because this is a profession that doesn't really tell you you've done enough or you can ease up. So having somebody who can help you understand you are doing a lot, you're doing too much, you should take a break, that kind of thing, and actually tell you you'll be okay for doing that is super important. Brad Johnson is another mentoring researcher at the Naval Academy, and he talks about mentoring. This is probably the most succinct, kind of well-known definition. And yes, Kevin, I will have these slides for you. It's a personal relationship, of course, intimate, more experienced person, usually older, but not always older, right? I think about my own advising relationship with my advisor, Bridget Terry Long. She is a year older than me. Now, experience-wise, she is, light years ahead of me, but I always marvel at the fact that this is somebody who I would have been in high school with, and yet still she had such knowledge and depth of expertise that was so helpful to me. Faculty member or professional who acts as a guide, role model, teacher, and sponsor of a less experienced, usually younger, but again, not always, graduate student or junior professional. I also argue that mentorship is critical in the socialization issues of faculty. Absolutely. And of course, mentoring is contextual. So mentoring in your institutional context matters. I'm at UT Austin with Charles, and he will tell you, we have quite a culture here, right? It's important to understand how this culture operates, but you also have a professional community you're a part of, SPR and other organizations you're a part of. So all of these things are essential to help you understand how to navigate and successfully thrive in those spaces. And mentoring really brings you into those hidden curriculum pieces that are not always obvious. So now we've talked about mentors. Now, those of you who are serving as mentees or proteges, I would love to know from everybody, what do you think makes a good mentee? This is the issue of mentorability again. So the code is 320818, and we should see your responses pop up in a few seconds. So again, looking at the frequency, honesty comes in there. Teachable, open to feedback. Yes, exactly. I will tell you that one thing, this actually came about because I was doing a presentation for early career group at my organization, which is the Association for the Study of Higher Education. And I talked to a group of folks who were both mentoring researchers, but also really great mentors. And I asked them the same question: what do you look for in a mentee? And I got a sense of frustration from them because they were saying things like, there are people I'm trying to help, but they're not very open to being receptive to the help I'm giving. And of course, we all have to be approached a certain way, but the biggest thing I think was this idea of openness and being open to feedback, right? If I'm sharing something with you that would be helpful to advance you, I hope that you hear what I'm telling you. And of course, we're all adults, we can make decisions about what to do after that. But that definitely is something that came out. Teachable, I think, fits that same kind of thing. I see open-minded. Honesty, yes, absolutely, without question. Enthusiastic, yes, because people often will say, and this is the funny thing about doing research that I've done, I tend to talk to mentors more than mentees. And mentors usually say at me at some point in time in the interview will say, hey, Rich, I don't know if I'm supposed to know this or not, but I actually get more out of the experience than my mentee is. I'm having way more fun. I'm learning way more than they are. Is that okay? I'm like, that's actually great. So yes, the enthusiasm is a really important piece. It can kind of spark folks. Maybe you're in a spot where you're just kind of going through the motions. You've got a new young person coming through who's got great ideas. That can definitely get you going. Dependable, inquisitive, absolutely, engaged. All those things are totally true. So yes, you've got the groundwork, I think, essentially of what mentorability looks like. And we'll talk more about that later on. So let's talk about the best practices that I've gotten to know over the years of doing mentoring research. This came up in the word cloud on both, but without question, trustworthiness. There's a whole sort of literature emerging about mentoring dysfunction. It's called the dark side of mentoring, which I don't like that term, but anyway, dysfunction in mentoring. Trustworthiness, absolutely. And trust in the sense that, can I depend on you to follow through on things you said you're going to do? Yes. But more importantly, can I trust you to understand and delve into issues or concerns I have? And that's something that often comes across. If you come to me and say, Rich, I've got this issue or challenge I'm dealing with, and I dismiss it, then you're kind of eroding the trust issue, right? Honesty, without question. There's a concept that I write about in my dissertation about the black bee, right? And I talked to a professor and she says, listen, I am the person who is on a, warpath about this. And she said, what it is a lot of well-meaning liberal white faculty won't really challenge our students of color, our black students in particular, to really, grapple with the work. And they'll give them a B to get them to go by. But I sit in meetings when we talk about students, and these students are not given much respect. They're not going to be considered for positions. And I'm often the first person to say to them, your work is at this level. Now, that's a hard conversation, right? Especially when you have people saying, well, I'm getting A's in other classes. But she said, this is the honesty that I want to bring to the relationship. I want to make sure students know they can trust me, but also want to make sure they know the feedback I give them, which should not just be negative, but certainly if it is, you need to do better, I want them to know that this is coming from me, honestly. Sharing networks. So mentoring, most recently, I would say in the last 10, 15 years, people like Bill Reagan's, who are really at the top of the game, are really talking much more about networks. So developmental networks are the bigger category that mentoring falls under, but a great mentor is going to be a person who shares those networks. So you're not just going to be in spaces figuring it out by yourself. They're going to take you to conferences. They're going to introduce you to their colleagues. They're going to make sure you know that these places exist, because I don't know how many of you are first gen. I'm first gen. And that means since I've been 18, pretty much the entire college education experience has been new stuff. And so it's been critical for me to have people who have been willing to open up what they know, and also tell me what I don't know, right? Like, I don't know if you know this, but there are organizations that look into this kind of work. And I actually have a person I know in there. And Philip's exactly right. Social capital is what we're talking about. Embracing intersectional identities without question. So we are not just, black, female, queer, whatever the identity is. We're multiple identities. This is Kimberly Crenshaw's work. And, understanding that I'm navigating the world from my positionality with these multiple identities that I might experience oppression in is super important versus sort of minimizing them or glossing over them. I would say that somebody like David Thomas would probably say, if you have congruence in what you think is salient and what you don't think is salient, that actually could work. So if you are a mentee who perhaps is not as concerned or engaged with one aspect of your identity and your mentor is as well, that might work out okay. But generally, my experience has been when I talk to mentors, they embrace the entirety of their mentee. They're like, I'm really proud of my mentee for what they do as a scholar or a researcher, but what they do as a person, as a family person, that kind of thing. Probably most important, invested in your success. They actually take it very personally. They want to see you succeed. They want to support you in that process. If you suffer a setback, it's a setback to them as well, right? And this is really interesting, knowing when relationship's going to change. And I've had a lot of interesting conversations with people when they say, I have a mentee and it went great until something happened. And usually it's not like something traumatic. It's like they graduated, they got their doctorate, they became a peer. In some cases, they became a rival. And this exact what I mean by that is somebody who you actually compete with for certain things. And so what that means is basically you have to know when to exit the relationship. And the exit relationship is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Perhaps you become peers or friends, and then that's a new stage of the relationship. Perhaps you see tendencies that make it look like we're not going to be doing things productively with each other. You agree to not engage anymore. And that's also good, because the toxicity is often because, well, we're supposed to be working together. And I really resent this person for a number of reasons, but we're still working together, versus kind of saying, maybe it's time for us just to kind of go our own ways. And it's okay. I think that's the thing that's, when I teach my mentoring course, I talk to students about a lot, is that mentoring relationships end, and it's okay to end. It's not like something you should feel is a failure. So let's talk about expectations. This is super important. When you sit with your mentor and your mentee, you've got to figure out where you're going, right? The duration of the time you're going to be together. And SPR has a time limitation on the mentor relationship, but certainly can go beyond that. But you're probably thinking in the next 2 years, what are we going to try to accomplish together? Secondly, what kind of investment are you comfortable with? Some people are like, I'm happy to meet with you weekly, monthly even. I'll travel to meet you when the pandemic's over, that kind of investment. And some folks are like, look, my commitment is such that I can only allocate this much time. But having that expectation up front and clear is really important, because one thing I often see is when people are saying, well, I feel my mentee is not really engaged in the way I want them to. You talk to the mentee is like, it's going great. Well, it looks like the mentor expects you to be in touch more frequently and you don't. So you should actually talk about that and figure out what that right level of engagement is going to be. What are you trying to accomplish? So sometimes it can be literally this manuscript I'm trying to get out. That's what I want to have done in the next 2 years. Or it can be more squishy. Well, I want to advance my career to this certain point, to be in these certain circles, compete for these kinds of grants and opportunities, right? But it's good to talk about what that is. And of course, that's going to change over time. Like, do not feel you have this conversation one time and that's it. And of course, what are you wanting to cover? This is so important because obviously, most of the time you're put together because there is a research connection of some kind, right? You have a research objective and the two of you in the dyad have this connection. But maybe you're more worried about work-life balance. Maybe you're trying to figure out, how do I navigate the academy and be a complete person? That's equally as important, if not more important, right? So make sure that you had a conversation about all the things that matter to you, right? Obviously, we can take for granted you're going to be saying the research objectives, want to do that. But perhaps you're interested in administration. Perhaps you're interested in being a public scholar. Perhaps you're interested in, ensuring your relationships outside of academia endure. You should make sure that's part of the conversation and see how willing the mentor and mentee are willing to engage on that. And certainly, it's important to know what are the things that you absolutely have to have in a mentor and a mentee, and what things are negotiable. One thing I'll talk about a little bit later on is this concept of mentoring constellations, right? Or boards of directors, right? So by no means should anybody feel that it's your job to do everything for your mentee and vice versa. Instead, we want to encourage people to do is to build networks that would create a number of people who can talk to you about different issues. And maybe the SPR mentor is specifically about your research and the academy, but it's going to bleed into other things as well. And certainly that means that you don't have to necessarily have this person be incredibly involved in some parts of your life that you don't think are necessarily important, because you have support in that space for other things. So this ties to the expectations, establishing norms. And norm establishing, I think, is, again, a living document. You can write it down, you can have a handshake over it, but basically, how will you communicate? Will you be texters? Will you be emailing? Do you get on a group chat of some kind? Or do you want to get on the phone and call somebody, Zoom with somebody, whatever you kind of feel? So find out what the person is. What I have found a lot is that we're talking about generational sort of gaps between mentors and mentees. Technology is a big thing. So I have found with my doctoral advisees at this point, I tell them to text me, or we get into a group me, because that's the way they communicate. And honestly, my email inbox is always a mess. So it's always easier that way. But just figuring out what's best. Some people are like, I can't do that. I've got to talk to you face to face on the telephone. So find out what the preferences are. Frequency of contact. This is super important. When you don't say what it's going to be, people worry, right? So the person who thinks once a month is fine, the person who thinks, oh, whenever I need help, there's going to be a disconnect there. And I've often run into people who've said, I think it's not going well. And when you talk to them, you find out they have a different understanding of time. Like, for me, I can just check in once a month. I'm fine. For me, I want to know what's going on once a week, right? And so you have to sort of figure out what that balance is. I do tend to think that the junior partner is the one who has the greatest responsibility here, because you're often the one seeking somebody's time. So it's important to figure out, what are you expecting? And then how does your mentor respond to that? Collaborating to set goals. So you may have goals that are very grandiose, and the mentor might say to you, well, that's really ambitious and we should definitely shoot for that, but let's sort of stack those goals. So if you don't get to that very, very pinnacle, you can at least say you've got 10 steps towards that place. this is really important. For mentees, you selected the mentor largely because there's something about what they've done that you really respect and you admire. So how do you want to leverage that? So if your mentor is the person who goes to the annual meetings and everybody knows this person and they're connected to everybody, and usually when you say a name, they can tell you how connected they are to that person, let them know. I really want to tap into the networks you have made. If your mentor is a person who's pulling down grants like it's nothing, talk to them. It's like, look, I want to understand how you do that. So make sure they understand exactly what are the things that you're looking for. Of course, hopefully other things will come up as well. But, it's really helpful. When I get approached a lot by undergraduate students, I usually want to know why they think I'm a good fit for them, besides the fact that I talk about mentoring or I'm a Black male. What else do you think that I have that would work for you? And then if I say like, yeah, that's really important, I think I can help you with that. That's really helpful. As I said earlier, the idea of constellations, don't think of mentoring as just a one-on-one kind of thing. I've really benefited from having mentors in my institutional context and beyond. In fact, when I was going up for tenure, I remember I had mentors outside of my university, and they were kind of telling me, Rich, I think you need to kind of put your foot in the gas a little bit, do some more, publishing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, well, people here think it's fine. They're like, well, you're not just trying to get tenure in your department or in your university, you're trying to get tenure on a national level. And that was great advice, because honestly, in my department, nobody had been tenured in about 15 years. So the calibration of what the expectations were a little bit off. So having that sort of multiple constellation arrangement was really helpful, because people were saying, this work is doing good. And in one case, I had a mentor call me up and say, I don't want to see another piece of work of yours in a edited volume. She said, you have ideas that are way too good. These are peer-reviewed journal level kinds of pieces. And I was first generation person. I'm like, well, it's getting published. She's like, but not in that venue. She said, get it published in peer review. And I was scared of peer review. I'm like, well, they're going to say bad things about me. But I recall that phone call, and it really kind of shook me out of that space of not wanting to be rejected, and kind of reminded me that if these ideas are that good, they should be in peer-reviewed journals. So anyway, that's an example of why the constellations are so important. Accountability is also super important. I recommend a timeline. The time you have together, map it out. The timeline can become your agenda. This is how far I am along on this idea or this concept or this project I'm working on. And of course, timelines, especially in this era of the pandemic, have to be flexible, right? So certainly allow yourself the ability to reassess and check in, which is my second point, which is being kind to yourself. The grace to reassess goals if they're too ambitious. I am really interested and concerned about sort of the lack of conversations we've had at this point about scholarly productivity during the pandemic. Because yes, one day we'll be able to go back to our offices and do things, but there are lingering issues about childcare, partner status, other issues we're dealing with, health issues. We're going to really have to start thinking about how that's going to impact how we do things. So I think reassessing is really important. When you have conflicts, that's really an opportunity to negotiate. Why do you feel I could do more than what I'm presenting? And have that discussion, right? Or why do you feel that what I'm proposing is too ambitious? And then you can, again, scaffold what you want to accomplish. So the end goal is not the manuscript being delivered, but it's getting on one of these steps. And if you get to 8 of those steps out of 10, you can still say this has been successful and we've made progress. I think this is really important. Realize when you need help with a relationship. And, Jennifer and Carrie, I'm sure, are going to be great resources, but realize when you're like, hey, I think we're hitting a roadblock here, or we're having a challenge communicating. Because a lot of times people kind of keep that under, and unfortunately, that's probably when you need to go out and say, I need to sort of crowdsource some assistance about how to deal with this. There tends to be a lot of shame with people when they feel like there's some kind of mentoring, I don't say dysfunction, but challenge. And a lot of times it's just a chance to sit down, to reassess and go over the expectations and the goals. But then sometimes it's just not a good fit. And I think, again, I would be the first person to tell people, I don't really think it's a great idea to invest a lot of energy in a relationship that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So let's talk about goal setting a little bit. Goals are really best done collaboratively. And again, there could be a slight disconnect about ambition, more or less ambitious. And again, factor in things like a pandemic, factor in things like your own work-life balance challenges you're encountering. And so it's good to talk about that and figure out what works best for both of you. Make sure they're measurable and broken down. As I said earlier, not my goal is to get, this big grant, but my goal might be to do the things that position me for the grant opportunity. And that way you can actually say, I did all of these things. Maybe I didn't get the grant this time, but at least I've done all the things I need to do. And I know I can improve on that last step the next time. This is where mentors can be really helpful to leverage your experience and knowledge. You've been in this game a little bit longer. You can probably give some really keen insights about what makes sense, what's realistic, what's going to be a real challenge, right? At the same time, you don't want to, burst people balloons and tell them they can't do something or they shouldn't do something, but you want to just sort of position your experience, but humbly do it too. Because I think sometimes people can be very determinative about what they know, right? Versus, here are some things that have worked in my experience. They might work in yours. And here's what I've seen over the years that I've been in the field. Doesn't mean that it can't be another way, but this is just something you should know. And also, these goals can always be reassessed. It's a living document to be responsive to the context. Carrie's got this great comment about what's happening at University of Maryland. Make sure that you're responding to those contextual differences, right? If something has come up, if something with your health or a loved one's health comes up, reassess and know that that's not a failure. To say that the goal was originally to get the manuscript out, but now we've decided to kind of scaffold it more because other things have happened. I think it's really responsible and good practice. And so reciprocity, social exchange theory, George Hohmann's work obviously tells we invest in relationships that we feel we get something out of, right? One of the most interesting things I've observed is a lot of times, especially with the person who's the junior partner, they often feel that, well, I'm not doing anything to help this person. They're giving me advice and they're showing me the way to get things done. And sometimes you have to be reminded that your enthusiasm, your ideas, your innovations, your grasp of technology, whatever it is actually quite motivating for the senior partners. I said earlier, I've had so many people come to me and say, this is something that is really getting me going because I was kind of in this place, kind of trading water, but this new person who's come in my life is doing amazing things and getting me excited about stuff. So know that sometimes you're doing more than you think you're doing. It's not simply dispensing advice. Sometimes it's a vibe of excitement and generative feeling and engaging and orienting people to new literature. I do this work with the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. Well, the foundation formerly known as Woodrow Wilson Foundation. And I talk to the senior advisors, the mentors, and they often tell me, like, I've been toiling away in my field for many years, and there's this new person just coming to their postdoc, and they've got this new literature they're exposing me to, these new ideas. I think it's really great. It keeps me fresh. So a lot of times it's the reminder that you actually do bring more than you think you do. Now, if you feel it's not happening, it's probably good to talk about that. And mentors, it's good to remind your mentees what you're getting from the relationship. Like, I really enjoy us talking. I'm learning a lot about your work. You've got a methodological approach that's different than mine. I'm really appreciating that because sometimes that is something that people feel like, I don't think I'm putting in as much. And that leads to people giving less, right? If they feel it's one-sided. So I said I was going to touch on this very quickly because we're going to actually talk about this probably the next time we meet, mentoring across difference. So, show of hands, how many of you are being mentored by somebody who has a difference, either, racial, gender, socioeconomic, institutional type difference, that kind of thing. So yes, it is happening, right? So it's important to, first of all, be aware of identities, right? To be aware of privileged and oppressed identities, right? And this is not a personal thing. It's not how you feel about identities, but if somebody is of a identity group or intersectional identities that experience oppression, it's important you know that's happening, right? And this is really important because I've heard this a lot of times when somebody will say, look, I was on campus today and these things happened to me, and I feel that was, a microaggressive sort of environment. And then the person says, well, are you sure? Maybe it was something else. Like this lack of validation, right? That's not what it was. It's totally something that's kind of erodes the trust in the relationship. To be able to hear somebody say, I experienced these things, and to say, it sounds terrible. I hate that it happened to you. Tell me more about it and help me understand how the event came to take place versus sort of the questioning and querying. It doesn't mean you can't ever say to somebody, well, maybe other things are at play as well. But I know if your first response is to invalidate, that certainly is not helpful. I think it's important to have clear and continued communication expectations. Like, how are we doing? Are we working okay? Are things going well with us? Are this actual concept of us working together? And actually taking some time when you meet to talk about how you feel the relationship is going. Hey, there's a big conference coming up next week. I really want you to be there, or help me make some connections. Talk about that as well, and not just the instrumental things you're doing along the way. This is really important too. This has happened a lot, and I'll give you an example. My very first job out of graduate school, I was working in student affairs. I was a hall director, and I was growing. It's hard to think about this now, but I have lots of hair. But at the time, I was like, I might want to grow out, dreadlocks. And I talked to my supervisor. She was a white woman. She was wonderful. And but she's like, it's great. Go ahead and do it, Rich. You should go for it. And my boss's boss was a Black man. And we sat down and talked, and he says, well, Rich, I think you should do what you want to do, but let me give you some things you need to think about, right? How you'll be assessed, how people will think about you. He didn't tell me don't do it or do it, but he had an understanding that was just so much more nuanced, right? Because he had lived those experiences. He's like, yes, I can tell you, if you walk into a space with dreadlocks, people are going to make assumptions about you. Are you okay with that? Can you deal with that? That kind of thing, which quite frankly, I don't think my supervisor, it would have been almost churlish for her to kind of bring these up, right? She hadn't had those experiences. He had. So this is important. Like when you have that kind of identity concern come up, to really tap into people who can assist. One of the best practices I've ever seen was a white male professor who's Jewish, probably mid-60s. And he said, I have a black woman mentee. And she came to me and talked about something that she experienced, I think at a interview for a postdoctoral fellowship. He said, I immediately got on the phone, called one of my very good friends, and asked her to have a conversation with her. So I did the introduction. I got them together. They met. And after they had the conversation, I asked her how it went, because he certainly had ideas and thoughts he could lend to the situation. But that very specific contextual experience that Black women experience on the interview circuit was very specific. So he said, I learned a lot from that. So now I have more information I can use when I have that interaction in the future. But I also wanted to make sure I was respectful of the fact that that was something that I hadn't experienced. And I probably would not have been the most helpful simply telling her, this is what I think. I tapped into my networks and resources to assist her. So a couple of tools, and I pass this on to Jennifer, and so you'll have access to these. And we'll actually use this next time, but there's a sort of handout I've created that's about effectively managing a cross-identity relationship worksheet that you could actually sit down with your mentor and work out, or you can have a phone call about it and just kind of walk through the different parts of it. And it's really a chance to reflect on your own experiences and your own identities, right? Expectations for relationship, it's kind of a, your own document you can use to kind of figure out, what do you want out of this and what do you plan to contribute? And again, you could share it with your partner, or you could just sort of use it as a talking point. I also sent out a sort of infographic about mid-career mentoring. It's about mid-career and higher ed specific for my field, but certainly I think it works for everybody. So just thinking about how do you negotiate and navigate the space that you're in. And I think it's applicable to whether you're early career or mid-career, it should probably work. And finally, many of you are familiar with the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. Carrie Rockmore has this incredible mentoring map. It's down this website, but I'll have it in the next slide. You can take a look at it. But she basically walks through all the functions of mentoring and kind of helps you plot out who fits on this sort of network, right? And the goal is that when you do this, you might actually say, my gosh, I have great mentors when it comes to opportunities and feedback, but really nobody for emotional support. So it kind of helps you see what are some areas you might want to have people help you with, right? Really important and helpful model. You know, those of you who like sort of graphic organizers, it's really kind of a nice way of thinking about it. So we've had a lot of talking. So this is kind of as we kind of come to the wrapping up of it. I want to throw it back to you. You've heard a lot from me. I'm curious, now you've had this immersion into what mentoring is, you've had some overviews of how to set expectations and goals. What's going to be your next step? So this is an open-ended kind of question. So if you go and put the Menti code in 320818, you can talk and sort of share what you're going to do next. And hopefully that'll inspire folks who are maybe like, yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do next. Now I've had this session with Rich. I've got some literature. I've got some information, got some points. What are you going to do next? Timeline. Really good idea. Yeah. I'll put some links in for my research. Yeah, I think you're all exactly what you need to be doing. Like, you know, hopefully there's something here that's like, okay, that's a next step, because having a really good presentation is fine, but if you walk away without idea what to do next, I'm not sure if there's if we've met our goal. But I see a lot of goal setting opportunities that people are talking about, meeting with mentors, setting up meetings with your mentors. Yeah, it's never too late to actually work and improve what you have going on. The parameters of relationship are important too. I talk about the fact this is an intimate relationship, right? It's also important to realize that some people are less comfortable talking about some aspects of their life. That's okay too, just as long as you both agree that's something you'll do. And certainly, you know, maybe it's just checking in and seeing how is life treating you generally versus how is life treating you in regards to this specific thing that is very much your business. So this is great. I'll make sure we get a chance to circulate this as a group so you'll see what people are working on. So as I wrap up in the sort of presentation aspect of this, hopefully out of this, you get the idea of what mentoring entails, and you've got a clear understanding of expectations, norms, and accountability. There's at least piece you can walk away and say, I know what this means. The other thing is the fact that it's reciprocal relationship. I know when I was initially engaging in work of mentoring or even getting people to mentor me, I would feel very insecure because I felt like people were pouring so much into me and I don't know what they were getting from me. And of course, now I'm a little older, more experienced. I understand the thrill of having somebody who's really engaged and really bright and enthusiastic and how exciting it is for me to put something into them. So absolutely understand that's part of what's going on. I want us to celebrate mentoring across difference, right? I think it's super important to be proud of the fact that you're working with somebody who has a very different life experience than you. Certainly it can be challenging pieces of it, but it's also rewarding. I've been really, I guess, honored that people have shared with me, you know, what I call the hidden curriculum. White male mentors have told me, well, you know, when this situation occurs, you know, this is what people think. I had an experience recently where I had some mentors sort of tell me, this is how people are perceiving what you're doing right now. And that was really rewarding to hear that outside of my own headspace, that people were kind of perceiving me the way I wanted to be perceived. So just know that's an important part of this. Empathy and communication and a willingness to lean into courageous conversation helps. That is, there will likely be places where I don't understand that experience. I haven't had that experience. I would argue that many of us have had proximal experiences of being othered. We know something about what it's like to be marginalized, but not the same exact experience. Well, guess what? Opportunity to lean in, to be courageous, to sort of understand that experience better. The resources, I've given you a couple, referenced a couple in the presentation, use them. And I think most importantly, especially in this environment, is to really just care for yourself and your colleagues, right? I think self-care has become probably the most important thing we're working with right now. Many of us are doing way too much and not doing enough to take care of ourselves. We're worried about our colleagues, our families, our students, and we should really look inward and make sure we're taking care of ourselves. As Charles will tell you, I just bought a under desk bicycle. I don't have it today, of course, I forgot it, but you know, the goal is like, I'm going to try to make sure I do more self-care and more physical work because I don't do a whole lot of it right now because I'm sitting in front of a computer most of the time. So that's certainly something we should be thinking about in this particular moment. Dorothy about roller skates. I went skating with my kids last week, and I am not that good at skating anymore, which is a tragedy. I used to be a great skater, and now I can barely stay upright. But yeah, we should all go skating at some point in time. So yeah, so that's what I've got. I know there's a question in the chat, but that's my information right there. We'll be doing more of these conversations, so do not feel this is the last time you can talk to me. That's my email, that's my Twitter. But I'll go ahead and start with the first question in the chat. And certainly as people want to jump in with other questions or thoughts, reflections, happy to do that. And Erica, you've just mentioned that you're using a Google Doc, yes, with notes and action items. I have really become a fan of the Google Doc and giving people the link to it so you can add to it concurrently. I don't know if my colleagues are all on board with Google Doc. They're like, yeah, we'll send you a Word document, mark it up. I actually like the real-time ability to sort of make changes. That's a great idea. Kevin, you've got a question. Whose responsibility is it to track goals and keep things accountable, like writing stuff down and coming back to it? I want the mentee to track those things, but I often need to teach, write it down as a strategy. That's a good question. It's a negotiation, right? Now, I think generally, this is the thing about mentorability I think is important. I think as a mentee, you're probably the person more responsible for tracking progress towards goals, right? The collaboration piece about setting the goal, absolutely. The piece about who tracks the goals, that's probably going to be on your side of things. And again, hopefully your mentor is engaged enough to be able to say, yes, I remember we said we're going to get this done. We're at this point. Actually, I think you're a little bit further ahead than you think you are. So I'd move yourself up a little bit further in that part. But one of the aspects of mentorability, I think, is being able to sort of assess, I am the person who tracks this information primarily, certainly not solely. So if you come to your mentor and you're kind of like a blank slate and there's nothing there and you're just giving all the information out, that's not probably right balance either. But, you know, talk about it. And perhaps your mentor is really good and loves keeping track of things like that and will do that. I know when I'm sitting with a mentee, using my advisees, when I think about that, I have an advisee that's getting ready to go in the market. You know, this is going to be interesting in, you know, 2020, 2021 when she goes in the market. But I'm often taking notes myself to sort of keep track of what she's talking about because she's often raising issues that I hadn't thought about. I'm like, oh, yeah, we've got to think about how we're going to address, you know, your productivity going forward because you've got a dissertation, you do, you know, interview studies. How does the pandemic impact what you're doing, right? Good questions that perhaps I hadn't thought about. So I think maybe the two-way piece, the Google Doc idea for Erica is a really good one to make sure we have that. So yes. Dorothy, you have a question.
Yeah, I'm just being lazy, not typing it in.
Hey, save the energy.
Yeah, I really appreciated your discussion about when the mentoring relationship has to change. And one thing that I've struggled with over my career is the unfortunate necessary disconnection. So as my students graduate and they go into Research One institutions, that there's this message that they're told that you have to differentiate yourself from your advisor or mentor.
Right.
And that, I'm curious if that in your research, you've looked at that, where you almost have to put your hands up and say, we can't, you've got to go on your own, right? Like, and you have to establish your own independent line of research. And for me, that's been very, a part of the academy that I don't really appreciate, because I think you can have an independent line of research and still publish and do work and benefit. So I'm just curious, Richard.
Yeah, this is a great point of discussion. And, you know, I'm fairly new to this sort of senior faculty game. I just got promoted actually, Charles announced my promotion in February on Valentine's Day. Thank you, Charles. Uh, so, as a full professor, I have a very different take now because I think what you're saying is so true. There is some kind of archaic, somewhat problematic constructions we have in the academy, right? And I think we can legitimize the importance of establishing a body of research that is your own. Absolutely, right? But I will tell you, when I was going up for promotion to associate, I had published a book with my mentor, Charles Williott, and it was like that process and experience was so valuable to me. And I got through. I guess it was okay, but I needed to do that. And I think what we can do as mentors is maybe talk about ways that we can still keep those connections going, but also making sure that the mentee is doing the things they need to do. I think a lot of times we have to sort of dig into the nuance of these things, right? The arm's length thing. I remember actually having this experience where I thought I couldn't even talk to potential referees, right? Because I'm like, I don't want people to know I have any influence. And then I was told, like, no, it's okay. You can collaborate. You can be on panels together. That's not a problem. It's just, you shouldn't be publishing things, 1-2 author things, like that kind of thing. But I need to have that conversation and walk through it. And I need to be validated to say, I actually have a really productive relationship with my mentor. I don't want to let that go. And they're like, well, that's okay. You should. So I think it's incumbent upon us to really sort of walk through those nuances about what's acceptable, and also encouraging again, this is a great point of having networks, right? Well, maybe you shouldn't be working with me on this project, but I've got a really good colleague who's doing similar work. Work with that person. They'd be great to work with. But even then, you have to kind of strategize about, well, that's a potential referee, make sure this person. So I think it's complicated, but I think just even engaging in that conversation is so helpful, because I didn't really have that happening a lot for myself until I started talking to people more about that. Like even something like authorship, right? I was kind of like, I'll be, my grad student could be the first author. Like, not yet, hold on, wait for that. And explain to students why you're doing that. So I've had a really good experience of walking my grad students through, if we're working on a project together and I've conceptualized the idea and I've got the funding for the idea, I'm the first author. Maybe if you do a lot of work on this, you're the second author. I mean, yeah, but that's what they have to understand. And once you leave this place, I'm happy to be, we had a postdoctoral fellow in my department. We did a piece together, we had WT grant funding for it, and she was the first author because that was the way it should be. But anyway, helping people understand why that is, because that's often a point of confusion. I hear a lot of stress from grad students, especially about author order. I'm like, that's the first thing you talk about. That's when you sit down together, that is the first conversation you have. Author order, and what does it mean to be first, second, third, and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
Sure.
Rich, it's Charles. I don't know if there's a cue. I raised my hand in the chat, but
very good.
Would you maybe talk a little bit about one of the things that I'm aware of increasingly? I think the further along I get, the more I'm aware of just the variance, the sort of the developmental variance of what mentees need from mentors. So even if you look like just within graduate students, of course, their developmental needs for mentorship early look different than what they look like when they've advanced to candidacy. Right. Likewise, when we're mentoring postdocs or we're mentoring junior colleagues in the professorial ranks, or sometimes even peer mentoring, people who are otherwise at our similar levels, but who we're doing peer mentoring with. Talk a little bit about how some of the challenges might vary based on sort of where you're meeting that mentee developmentally.
That's a really good point, Charles. I think, it's kind of that sort of sharpening your toolkit, right? Because my first year mentoring experience is really helping people understand we should be publishing anything together. Let's do a chapter together, that kind of stuff. When it's like candidacy time, or my students are looking at jobs, okay, let's try to get something in a peer-reviewed journal. Let's try to get something in a really highly ranked journal, those kinds of things, that evolution. So I find myself doing a lot of scaffolding because I do have this tendency in my experience, and I know yours is similar to mine, first-gen students who are like, I'm just trying to figure this thing out, which is nice because it would probably be really interesting to work with somebody who actually knows what they're doing. Because I'm kind of figuring this out myself. But what I try to do is also remember and relate to what it was like to be in that situation. So I had a conversation with my students about his qualifying exam, He's working on it, and it needs work, right? And I kind of had to go back and say, look, when I was in your experience, I remember distinctly walking out of my advisor's office and trying to count the steps to the stairwell so she wouldn't see me crying, because I was like, I spent 3 weeks working on that, and you say it's like a total redo. Like, how did that happen, right? So I think the empathy piece is really important, to never get, and you're a good example of this, Charles, never get so far ahead of in our titles or our positionality to forget what it's like to put something on paper and then get feedback that's not great, right? I also think it's also helping them to sort of develop that thicker skin that needs to be developed at some point in time. I remember, I think my first class I taught, it was a qual research design class, and I had put together the first piece off my dissertation, submitted it, and got, reviewer number 2 just tore me a new one. I mean, you know what you're doing, you don't know how to conduct qualitative research. I think, no, the exact phrase was, this is not how qualitative research is done. And I was like, they let me through school because I was there long enough. They felt sorry for me. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And I went to my class and sort of showed them the letter. I'm like, this is what happens in the academy, right? So I have a really good colleague, you know him, and he's at University of Kentucky now. And he said, like, are you going to resubmit it? Because you need to do that. Go ahead and get back on the horse. And so a lot of me is sort of reminding them of that. Like, we are in intentionally critical spaces. I mean, critical, small c critical, right? We're gonna get feedback on our work. Some of the feedback is worthless. Some of the feedback is actually helpful. And we're gonna go back and we're gonna get back on the horse. That was the most important thing I heard after that sort of imposter syndrome stage, to really understand that a lot of this is about persistence, right? And being able to understand that reviewer number 2 isn't necessarily coming after you because they don't like you or don't respect you. They don't think your ideas are good for whatever reason. And there's a number of reasons, and we all know what those reasons could be. They can be completely disconnected from anything to do with the person doing the work. And frankly, dismissive, especially when people are bringing perspectives that are not represented in the academy a whole heck of a lot. And just Kimberly Griffin, who's my good colleague at University of Maryland and just a dear friend, we went through a very arduous R&R process on an article. And I was like, I am done. I'm ready to write a 2-word email to the editor, and the first word starts with F. And she's like, no, let's take a breath. She said, it's getting it sharper, it's getting it clearer. In the worst case scenario, if we don't get success here, it'll be ready for the next place. And that was such a great thing to hear, because first of all, we were successful getting the piece accepted. And I learned a lot about just the patience of going through that whole thing. So I think we have an opportunity to contextualize what people are experiencing at different stages. And it's just to be aware of the fact, okay, this really hurts right now, but this is sort of a common thing that happens to get the rejection from the top journal that happens the first time out, usually for a lot of us. And it's okay. And you can, in fact, one of my biggest thrills is getting stuff in the journals that have rejected me. Like, hey, remember this back in 2007? I'm in, So I think that's one thing that's been really helpful for me, Charles. And I think also bringing a larger picture perspective about who we are as people, as parents, as partners, as friends. It's helpful to remind people of that, because I think sometimes we can get very insular in what we do here and not think about the fact that we are multidimensional beings. And, it's probably better that you are slightly better at doing the parenting thing than doing the writing thing at this particular moment. I hope that's helpful. You all should know I go to Charles for these kinds of questions. He asked me a question I usually ask him. So it was interesting.
I have a question from the mentee perspective. I think, at least for me, when thinking about mentors and the advantages that the mentors that we have through this program offer, is for me, it's a lot of the process stuff. Like, they're really good at managing multiple agreements and contracts, or they're great at managing a team of people who are working for them, or providing mentorship to other people. And those are all things that I want to learn how to do better in my position. So it's less like it seems harder to operationalize and timeline something like that. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions or advice related to goal setting and planning around things like that.
Yeah, Krista, maybe your case is more of competencies than it is like a timeline. Like maybe it's, I want to be able to, you know, get the hacks from you, how you manage multiple things. And you know, you can think of it that way too. Maybe not necessarily like a timeline with the end result being a submission for a grant or a book, or it could be, in fact, I want to get competencies and skills in these areas. And I, you know, the first time I had a grant of any consequence, that whole process was like, what? I don't, you know, I know what you mean. So, and that was just for one fairly small grant. So I can see why it's so important. But I think it's really, one of the things we don't get really taught to do is really how to manage the apparatus outside of our own heads, right? We're taught how to write and how to research and how to, analyze, but we aren't taught how to run a lab. We're not taught how to, and in fact, that means that we often derive those thoughts. I'm reminded of Dan Lordy's work in School Teacher, right? Where he says basically teachers teach the way they were taught, right? So researchers research the way they were sort of demonstrated to, right? So I think one of the things could be this idea of competencies. Like, I want to learn how to do this one thing. And maybe that means I'm going to shadow you at some point in time. Maybe you're going to sit down with me and give me a good half-hour run through of the things that you've learned. How do I use, the research and the staff you have in your college or department that helps you sort of figure these things out. But this is, again, Krista, I think really important to sort of ask people to unpack the invisible and hidden curriculum piece. I still think even when you are being as transparent as possible, there are like 3 or 4 things embedded in every sentence we say as scholars that is like, what does that mean? Can you break that down? And I think it's the opportunity you have now, is to really have somebody walk you through all those pieces, or even reverse it around and have them come observe what you're doing, and they can tell you, well, I would have done it this way. I would have tweaked it this way. Or actually, you're doing a pretty good job with this. It's just messy, right? It's just probably not satisfying to hear that, but that's also true sometimes. I remember one of my mentors now is a dean of student life at our university, and I used to work with her when we were working at MIT, and she was a fairly new professional. I was a graduate student, and now she's like a big deal. And I got to sort of hang out with her for a day and just sort of remembered how she did things, or taught me to do things when I was, a brand new grad student. And now she's like, no, I have people to help me do that. That's the thing for me. It's hard as a first gen kid from a working class background, is asking people to do things I can do myself. I can copy, I can staple, I can schedule. Why am I asking people to do that? And then, it was pointed out to me, like, well, because we want you to do something else. That's true, but we want you to do something else. And just always respect the fact that people who do that work are super important, but just know that's not what we have you here for. We have you for other things. And I gotta tell you, I still bristle with that. I'm not good with that. I've worked with people who told me, like, do not do that anymore. That's what I do. So that's something. But I think this is, again, part of the first gen experience, at least working class experience, is like, you don't really like asking people to do things that you can do yourself. It seems kind of rude. And they're like, no, it's actually a problem because you're not getting things done. My favorite quote is like, we perfected technology, we perfected transportation. We have not perfected the 24-hour day. It is what it is, right? And in this time of the pandemic, I find I'm like operating, 24 hours a day. I'm operating like 22 hours a day, because 2 of those hours are just completely non-functional. I'm not even talking about sleeping. There's 2 hours I just can't do anything, right? I'm vegging out, whatever. So I'm just trying to figure out that that's the reality for now.
Richard, I just put a comment in there to Krista that one thing I'd never really thought of, but I have a number of mentees that just sit in Zoom calls for our weekly lab check-ins. And they have found this to be, and they're not in the projects, right? Like, so one of my K Award mentees, she just sits there and she says she's learning so much, when in fact, we're just nuts and bolting it through all these various federal grants. But she says it's giving her lots of ideas of how to run her lab. Would never have thought that.
You know, Dorothy, that's something I've started to do now when I give a talk. Like, even I probably should have brought one of my students to this one. I'm trying to think, like, how can I just bring you into the process so you can see what it is I do, how I do it, that kind of thing. Because you're right, we learn things, good and bad, right, from what we see. And hopefully, if we're actually being intentional and saying, you should be part of this meeting, not because it's something that you need to be intimately involved in, but just so you can know what the pieces are, right? Or you're familiar with terms, or you've heard this, or you can debrief me afterwards and say, you were talking about this one thing, I don't know what that was about. I think that's so thoughtful and intentional, just to invite. And I'll say this about my graduate program. I have a lot of critiques of it, but I will say I got to do pretty much everything I do as a professor as a grad student. Not the same level, obviously, and not in the same participation, but I sat in curriculum meetings, I sat in search committees. I got to do all those things. And so a lot of times I didn't know what the hell was going on. Still true. A lot of times I didn't didn't pick up on some things, but other things I was just like, okay, it's interesting. I at least know how, and then for me, it was a lot observing what people did. Like, my favorite professor is awfully quiet in these meetings for some reason. Why is that? Because they're the person who's known as the processor. They don't say anything until the very end. They say something really intelligent. That's a skill set. I can learn from that. And I think just simply, like you said, being able to observe and see how people engage is so important, because, when you see your favorite professor in class or in the lab, you're like, that person's amazing. Watch them with 25 other amazing colleagues, how they interact. It's very interesting, right?
Rich, I'm also hearing in Dorothy's point, which I think is a really good one, and your follow-up is really good also. Just what she's providing is not a lot of effort in a certain way. She's creating a venue and just opening the door. And are there other examples of that, just in terms of those of us that do a lot of mentoring? We want to be available to as many students as possible, but there's just an efficiency issue in terms of how much we can give. Are there other examples like that if we just made a few small moves, we could bring more students to just benefit from the milieu of how our research teams operate or how we do things? Are there other examples like that you can think of? You mentioned having students join meetings like this, but are there other examples? And maybe some others out there have some.
I mean, I think for me, really understand the part of networking, right? So I have a mentee, Mariama, and she's a sponge. She's all about these things. And so whenever possible, I just tell her, come with me with these people to this meeting and just meet some folks, because, one of the things that happens, this is sort of the consequence of being good mentors. You get more mentees, right? That's what happens. And the consequence of being a bad mentor is that you don't get mentees, right? But one of the things I've tried to really work on in the cultural taxation piece is really making sure that we distribute the work smoothly across, right? I think, Jennifer, you just mentioned the group advising. I just did it this week. I bring in all my advisees together. I give some overview pieces, and I allow them to take the mantle of my post-candidacy students are great. They're better than me because they just finished that process. And they've got like real-time, advice about things. And so oftentimes I'm just coming in and sort of giving a little sprinkling of fairy dust, but they've laid down all the groundwork about X, Y, Z, do it this way. Yesterday I had a meeting with some graduate students, and there was a cross section of students from across our college, and, master students, first year, people in candidacy. And generally I found myself sort of having somebody ask a question and maybe giving a quick answer, and then this constellation of folks would come in and say, well, you should think about this. It was so good. And I think we have to sometimes decouple ourselves from the structural thing as being the be all know-alls, which is problematic, but that's how the academy is structured, and really help them understand there's a lot of knowledge in the space that simply comes from people who have done this a semester longer than you. To really sort of reframe this as not being something that, the sage on the stage, aspire to that person. I've often said the most important thing about a graduate program, you can't know it until you get there. And that's who's going to be in the program with you, right? The faculty are great, yeah, the staff are great, whatever they've been doing, but the people you see day to day, that's where I see the most enthusiasm. And I use the example of just this last week. One of my graduate school cohort mates is a visiting professor at UT Austin, so we had a chance to hang out. She's doing stuff for the college. Another one of them reached out to me to ask me to come do a lecture, and it's kind of like, who would have thought, 20 years ago, that the people we're trying to impress were the faculty members, right? But the reality is the people we really made a connection with and it really moved our careers forward are people who we were in class with, who we were doing homework with in the bar at 2 a.m. with. Those are the people who really have moved us forward. So just kind of helping them understand the galaxy of things that are happening. Yeah, I absolutely think, and I see, Bonnie, you have a great point about mentors. Yes, mentees follow your mentors around. Mentors, have your mentees come with you, invite them, and some of us, I'm introvert. You don't probably believe that's true. And so I need sometimes to be told, I really need you to come down and be part of this. It'll be fun. I'll buy you a drink, whatever it is, but come with me for this. And I'm so grateful for that, to have those opportunities where people thought enough to kind of push me a little, not just say you can come with me, but you need to come with me for this thing. Oscar, your question. You're a mentor of graduate schools or institution. Thank you for doing that, first of all. Yes, putting your oxygen mask on first. Absolutely. So that famous placard you get in the plane. I mean, I don't know who's been in the plane lately. I haven't been in the plane in a long time, but when you get in the plane, you have that little placard, put your mask on first. And generally the idea is that, you want to make sure that you're exhibiting the things for self-care and taking care of yourself first before you do things for others. Because I got a good colleague, Butch Ware, he's at UC Santa Barbara, Islamic scholar. And Butch is saying, he has this great quote, I'm going to butcher it, but he basically says, if we are the tools and we're pencils, a lot of us are broken pencils, right? We have a broken lead, we have no eraser, right? We get to be better at that. And I actually think the opportunity we have as scholars to sort of present, how is it you can be an accomplished, professional, respected person in your field, but be a good parent, a good partner, a good community member? Those are really hard things to do. And I don't want people to think that the job is to be perfect. It's not. In fact, I think I perfected the art of, apologizing, because I do it a lot. I'm often in the space where I have to apologize because I haven't done something, I haven't been in the space like I'm supposed to. But what I find is really sort of sometimes demonstrably saying, I'm not going to do meetings on Fridays. I tried this a few years ago, it didn't work, but I might try it again. Like I try to say, I'm not doing meetings on Fridays because I'm going to use that time for other things. That didn't last, so that's on me. But just at least articulating how important it is to make sure my students understand this, and importantly, to understand you have to forgive yourself. Work-life balance is a goal, it's a process, not a goal, right? No, you know what I'm trying to say, right? The goal is not to have everything level. It's to sort of make sure you're shifting as you need to be. And I guess I'm fortunate because there are 3 people who live with me who are pretty good at sort of pointing out to me that I'm out of balance. But even then, I should probably be better at figuring it out before they figure it out, right? I mean, that would be better if I was able to sort of figure out this is going on. So all the discussion we have about skating, we went skating last week. So my feet hurt from that. So I'm going to sort of lobby for a bike ride, or perhaps throwing the baseball around for a little bit. But and this is our big weekend for football, so we'll have to do it before 11 o'clock a.m. But those are the kinds of things I think are super important, and our students are watching us. I have a grad student; she's a professor now, and she said to me, she said, "Well, I looked at you and my colleague Victor Sines, and you guys looked like you were beaten up all the time. So I really had to think twice about doing this. I'm like, oh my God, I thought we did a good job with this. Apparently not good enough, right? Because he had concerns. But our jobs are hard. That's just not a negotiable. They are hard jobs. But I hope they see the joy. And I've actually made that point more and more about I get to kind of script what I want to do more or less. I teach classes, I have responsibilities, but that I can do a lot of things I want to do, which I don't know many jobs like that. Unfortunately, those experiences come pretty far, not far down the line, but they come a little bit later. When you're first on the tenure track, you're trying to get those papers out and get those grants, right? So maybe it's a little less that way, but also at least people understanding it's a temporary status and you try to shift. One of the biggest honors I had as a graduate student, I was part of the National Campus Diversity Project, and we were going around the country looking at best practices, trying to find a best campus. Didn't exist, of course, but we went to Rice and we met with Richard Tapia, the mathematician. And Richard Tapia is a legendary mentor, right? You can draw a line between Tapia and virtually every Latino PhD in mathematics, right? And so we thought Tapia was going to give us this great breakdown of his mentoring practice. And he told us, he's like, when I got here, the only thing I did was focus on promotion and tenure. That's all I did. I wrote, I published, I networked, I did all those things. So now I can do the things I want to do. But he's an outlier. I think most people who take that approach never refrain. They keep going that way. And I think, our promotion, our annual reviews are chances for us to reframe. Like, I can do some things differently than I used to do them. And I'm not a reframer either. I've always been this sort of community engaged person who's kind of done that and used the excuse of being first gen and not knowing any better as as a firewall. I didn't know any better. But I also learned, for instance, to leverage my scholarship into the spaces I work, which is not possible for everybody. But I do think those kinds of hacks that we learned and how we navigate the academy are helpful for people to understand. Here's an approach that might be helpful. And it may not work for you, but at least here's how I've thought about this. And I've had this conversation with a lot of my colleagues at UT. This is how I'm doing this, and I still have it. So I think the fact that we're still learning, even as senior scholars, is helpful. But again, we're demonstrating to our postdocs, our mentees, our students, this is a space of constant learning.
Hey, Rich, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, well, let's have a hard elephant in the room question. So I feel like folks are throwing softballs all day. So my reputation precedes me here. Everything you've said has been spot on, but I want to talk about this work in the context of mentees of color. As I tell folks, and I won't date myself, but my grandmother already told me I needed to work twice as hard to be half accepted. And so, and I appreciate the context in which you laid out things, but I don't feel like, or I have not seen enough that would convince me unequivocally that that is no longer something that I have to say or worry about, right? And as I told my two daughters, here's a good thing. If I'm right, you're okay. And if I'm wrong, you are better. And so talk about how you convey that. And so, and this is probably more of an ally question, right? So if there are any mentors who are mentoring researchers or mentees of color, understanding those dynamics and being able to differentiate one versus the other, right? So you gave that example where someone looked at your work and it said it wasn't good. And so this notion of, was that really the case versus being objective to say, I need to step up my game, but also understanding the importance of that. One of the things I tell folks is that, probably 10, 15 years into my career at RTI, I was still spell checking every email to make sure that was not one typo in it. Now, mind you, much of what I received from everyone else
was not that way.
All over the place. But part of that fear was that, well, he can't write, right? That those stereotypes that we still have to address and deal with. So I'd love to just kind of get your thoughts on how that plays in and recommendations for all of us as mentors. But, I want to strike a balance so that, Krista doesn't say, oh God, what did I get myself into? But I'm very unapologetic about how I approach these issues and being very transparent about them. And so anyway, I'll stop there and just kind of let you talk about that.
Well, Phil, thanks for bringing the wisdom of Black women to the conversation, because yes, that is so true, right? And this is an issue. I just dropped in my former advisor, Stacey Blake Beard, and Audrey Morell's work on tempered visibility. So, as folks of color, institutions that are predominantly white, we tend to be hyper visible. And hypervisibility is often a stress-inducing environment, right? But Blake, Beard, and Morell argue that there's ways to temper that, right? And there's ways to use that visibility to your advantage. And that's just a real good conversation to have. Like, one of the great things, and Charles knows this, like, okay, so this week I had a very hyper-visible experience. And in fact, I told Jennifer, I said, Jennifer's like, hey, is your agenda ready? I'm like, my work on Tuesday kind of went by the side because, long story short, the president sent an email to probably about 500,000 people. And my name was listed in it on a fairly controversial topic. So this is a hyper visible situation. And so one of the things that I talked to Charles about was, is this the opportunity that I should take? And his argument is the one that I heard from many other people, is like, this is an opportunity that you can shine in. This is a place where hyper visibility can work to your advantage. But certainly, let's make sure you have all the things you need going forward to support what you need to get done, right? So I think this piece of being just honest with people about the hyper visibility and invisibility, right? Brian Brayboy McKinley Jones talks about this issue of invisibility with Native American scholars. And I think that's a similar kind of thing. We can be hyper visible in one moment and revert to invisible in the next. And the key for us to figure out, how do we leverage those opportunities? And to me, it's about having strong mentors. So when a mentor says to me, Rich, this is like a bullshit assignment, this committee you're on, don't do that, waste your time. But this opportunity is something you really should do. I take that very seriously because I know they understand these contexts, right? They understand the importance of, being at the front of something and being involved in something and people seeing and noticing that. And one of the things, I'll give an example. I was asked to step into the space, which I felt was it was incredulous, because I was like, you're asking me to assess people on the basis of their teaching and be on a committee to give awards, which I haven't received yet. It's almost like an insult, right? But my mentor told me, when you're in that room talking to those people, you're going to impress them. And you're going to become a person on their radar screens. That wouldn't have happened if you just simply submitted a packet and you were an applicant. Being on the committee is going to actually give you a heightened sense of visibility. And sure enough, people would talk to me afterwards. It's like, well, how come you're not on this? I'm like, you tell me, I don't know, So that was something that I really, and this is what I think you're getting to, Philip, is like really making sure that you understand the dynamics and you understand. I was talking to a young woman who I'm mentoring in the Midwest, and she finished her program 2 years ago, and it's rough. She's having a very hard time. And I said, have you made cross-racial relationships with other people? So yes, the Black faculty or institution are overworked, they're culturally taxed, they're all disaffected. You might have to make a decision about whether you want to stay there or not. But do you have access to white male faculty there? Are they the people who you feel you could have a conversation with? And I asked that question because I don't know, because maybe they're not. She mentioned there was a professor in another department. I'm like, you need to go to lunch and you need to start talking to him about how he understands how you are placed in the situation. He may not be an empathetic person, but if he is, he's going to probably disclose some things to you that you might not be aware of. And I think one thing I've had to discover working at the PWI is that that's really important to know, how I am perceived by other people. Not that I would change how I behave, but I would just simply say it's something I need to know for my own protection. Yeah, go ahead.
I appreciate Philip sort of putting it so squarely on the table. It was on my mind too, I mean, part of what Philip is describing is you know, our identity and positionality, what it means to mentor a mentee of color. If you're a person of color, or if you're not, these matter. And so you know, when as you're responding to this, I'm thinking about how important identity is in this process. And you know, to some extent, you know, when I'm thinking about mentorship, I realize some of the conversations I have with junior faculty, with graduate students, are ones that I know it would be really hard for other people to have, because I've had to navigate these spaces in a particular way. And it might be more difficult for a faculty member who hasn't to even enter that conversation with a graduate student. And yet we all have this important role. And, you know, we of course, it's ludicrous to believe that only, you know, people of color can mentor people of color. However, those identities and positionalities are always in the room. So, and I hear that really strongly in Philip's voice, like how he internalized what he needed to do to endure. And, you know, it's hard to say those words that he said out loud, because he's effectively saying what he has to accomplish to deal with the headwind of how the system's situated sort of against the progress of people of color. So if you're a person of color, you've experienced it in certain ways, perhaps. And if you're not a person of color, maybe you haven't had the same nuanced experience. So how do you put your identity on the table if you're a mentee and a mentor to really honestly engage this space? Because to me, that's what it takes.
Yeah, there's some great chat going on right now about how we do these pieces. And this is the part that's critically important. So one of the challenges, I think, for especially our white male colleagues and our white women colleagues as well, is in those spaces to make sure that the advocacy doesn't stop, right? You know, I've been around long enough to know that people can be wonderful advocates when the stakes are inconsequential, but when they're actually very consequential, it's easier to be quiet about things. So reminding people of the contributions that our colleagues have made, especially if those contributions are not contributions that people consider to be canon, right? You know, you're working in a space that maybe, you know, you might have heard about this at UVA. There was a case of promotion and tenure in education, and the candidate had published in the Journal of African American Males in Education, a journal I publish in. It's a wonderful journal. It's the only peer-reviewed journal on African American males in education. And the reviewers, I mean, the committee members had said, this appears to be a self-published journal. And luckily, J. Luke Wood, who's a good colleague over in San Diego, got a posse together, literally a posse, called us all up and say, look, we need to put pressure on about this. I'm not saying it's what happened, but it was reversed. But that kind of stuff, like where's the allyship there? Like when somebody diminishes or cuts down a scholar of color's contributions, are you looking to sort of support that person's work? Are you looking to try to find holes in it? I'm just saying, to be fair about this, I understand you might say, honestly, looking at this person's work, it's not strong. But to let something like that happen, to show the gross neglect it would be, because you could Google Journal of African American Males in Education, and you would understand it is actually a peer-reviewed journal. You can go on Cabell's directory, you would find that out. They didn't even do that. And my question is, I don't know who in that committee was there, but nobody in that committee apparently took the responsibility of being an ally that seriously at that point, because that's the kind of thing that can shoot holes in somebody's dossier. And it almost did. Those are the kinds of conversations that we need to have. And you know, Philip, to me, it's really about establishing trust and saying to people things like, you know what, you might not hear this from anywhere else, but I'm going to tell you exactly what is said. And this woman I talked to in my dissertation, she said that. She says, I'm in the meetings with the professors you take classes with when they talk about people for fellowships and postdoctoral fellowships. Your name doesn't come up. You know why? Because your work isn't where it needs to be. But you can change that, you know, growth mindset. You can change that. That's not a fixed entity. But half of it is not, you know, getting high in your own supply. You have to literally understand, how do others perceive the work that you do? And it doesn't mean you change the work, but if your work, to your point, you have misspellings in it, your theoretical frameworks are not well fleshed out. If that's what's going on, correct that. And that's coming from love. That is a comment of love and appreciation to that very real concept about how we have to present ourselves in an environment that often diminishes the work we do if we have anything to do with race and ethnicity, as I have found out this week.
This is Velma, and this has been a really great presentation today. What I was thinking about, particularly as it relates to Philip's comment, and we have this construct that we use in our research called racial socialization, and it's really designed for Black parents to teach their children about race in the context of self-love and the reality of preparing for the real world that they are going to be a part of. And I view mentoring the same way. You have to speak truth about what's real, and then how one makes a place for themselves in this role of scholarship, and the respect that your work should convey regardless of the population that you study. And so I haven't thought about it except listening to Philip's comment, and I said, this sounds like racial socialization in the context of mentoring, because that's what it is. And so anyway, this is a great discussion. I'm glad you raised the issue, because it oftentimes is this invisible elephant in the room.
Well, Velma, first of all, thank you for that. And second of all, that's a publishable paper right there. You just put out there. You're exactly right. I mean, those are real consequential, but I would say the way that's framed is through love, right? And in fact, my proposal paper was called Ultimately It's About Love. And this is what that professor said to me. I love these students, which means I will say things to them that nobody else will say to them. And I'll say it to them understanding that they may never get that feedback the way I'm giving it to them right now. But of course, that means you can't start the first meeting we ever have by saying, your work is trash. You have to build that support and love. And so I feel very confidently, for instance, when I work with my advisees, I always tell them, I said, look, I'll say like Bridget told me, you can put up a dartboard of me in your house and throw it at me, because we're going to do this behind closed doors. So when you walk out of this closed door, your stuff is tight, as it should be. And I've had to have very challenging conversations about, well, I'm ready. No, you're not. You're not ready. Because, and I remember one time I let that happen when I was like, okay, I give up. Let's go have a proposal meeting. And the student got eviscerated. And that was on me, because I was like, I didn't do my job of sort of, and that's been a great cautionary tale for me to give to people. And they understand. I said, it's not really about the quote unquote humiliation. It's about presenting yourself as an academic entity and having that experience just negated because you didn't take care of 3 or 4 things you could have done very easily. It's not about being perfect or right. It's about being able to be a cogent engager in academic, experiences, and not being tripped up because you can't spell words properly or you don't know how to make a paragraph look right. Those kinds of things. And when I tell people that story, they're like, I got you. Like, okay, I can come to terms with the fact that I might need more time to work on this. And that's been really helpful. But, it came from hard experience in my case, acquiescing to the black bee. Okay, it's good enough. Let's go. And they're like, no, it's not good enough. And furthermore, you're further diminished because you're a woman of color. It would have been bad for anybody, but doubly bad for you. So, I learned from that.
Richard, this is Flavio.
Yes, Flavio.
Also, I want for you to talk a little bit about the role of the mentor when one of our mentees need to write about themselves. And maybe this is more about my own experience. When we come from cultures that we should not talk about ourselves or talk too much about ourselves, we're supposed to kind of blend in and, be humble. And then academia still continues to be, the rules are determined by white males. that they're very comfortable usually talking about themselves, as we know from the White House. And then what happened when a mentee writes like the first like third year review, and they're very humble, and how do we do that? How do we not to change the person? It's okay to be humble. How do we coach somebody to learn how to talk about themselves? It can be women in general, women of color, males of color, LGBTQ, you name it. There is something there that we need to help, but sometimes it's that dilemma. We don't want to change people to become this other person, but
Yeah.
we work, make it in this world.
Flavia, that's a great question. And actually something that came up very recently, we were talking about self-nominations for an award. And in my graduate program, we actually have a student award that is self-nominated. And that was intentional because we want students to have the experience of having to go through that. And I mentioned to you my student, Victoria Black. She's the most humble person you would ever meet. And, I had to really sort of say, Victoria, mentorability, TED Talk, that is your thing. That is your, that's your profile. Put it out there. And luckily she got the hits and it reaffirmed what I already saw. But I think you make a really good point. And to me, it's like about a competency. So understanding that this is part of what we do, and I'll give a shout out to our communication staff here at College of Education at UT. They're so good at helping us or reminding us, you're doing important work and we want to know it. And it's not really about your ego. It's really about, sort of amplifying the significant work that you're making, because something is happening in the world right now and you have a response to it. And so I recently wrote a piece about social media, and I imagine most folks in this space have a social media profile, either Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. But I really encourage you to do that because it actually helps you. And I use these 3 words: amplify, clarify, and I forgot the other one is. But basically, when you have a piece that comes out, you get to go on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook and say, I have this piece coming out. I've really understood and engaged in things, Flavio, like public scholarship, because first of all, it draws attention to my actual scholarship, right? The scholarship I'm doing behind paywalls and in journals. But it also makes me more comfortable with the contributions I've made. And a lot of times we need to be reminded. And so a lot of us are, as mentors, we can be responsible for sort of reminding our proteges that they're doing really good work. And it's important work. And they should be putting the work in spaces that they haven't thought about. And a lot of people get really freaked out by doing a news story. But you know what? It's, get to know a reporter who does education for your local NPR station. They're usually pretty accessible and they'll call you for ideas, right? So just understanding that part of what we do, and UT, it's different. We're a public flagship university with a very specific mission to serve the citizens of the state of Texas, right? So at some point, it is mission critical. It's what we do here. And I feel, to your point, Flavio, a lot of important work is taking place, but people don't want to be seen as bragging or self-reflective. But when you realize, as you said, the stakes in society right now are such that all of the people doing important work needs to be amplified. It needs to be out there. It needs to be pointed to. We need to make sure that our students, especially our Black women and our women of color, are being cited and referenced in the work that they do. Because a lot of times these ideas come out and it's like, that's not the first person who said that. That's why I follow Cited Sister. In fact, I have given them so many sort of bylines on things because I'm like, if you want to know who's doing work in this space, send a tweet out. They'll tell you. That doesn't excuse any of us from doing the work of being aware of what's happening in the field. But back to this whole issue about visibility, right? If you're publishing in journals that are less prominent because, some people in the academy have not found this to be deemed rigorous enough or whatever, right? You're not getting that same kind of circulation that you would like to in other places. So I think really helping students understand and mentees and postdocs and junior faculty that telling people about what you're doing is not bragging per se. it's positioning yourself in the conversation and the discourse so you can contribute to it. And that to me has been something that's been super important to do. And I know we have to do a lot to sort of encourage that, because people probably won't do it by themselves, but we have to tell them, like, there's an important conversation taking place. You're a leader in that conversation. Let's do what we can to get that work out there. And let's not be afraid to say your work is worthy of being recognized and accoladed in certain ways.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And Bonnie, that's a great sort of addendum. Yes, it's more specialized. I like that. A great example, Journal of African American Males in Education. It's not easy to get into that journal. It's very specialized. That means that when you talk about African American males in education, you better know what you're talking about, because everybody reviewing that piece knows that literature really, really well.
So Richard, we've come to our time, and I want to be respectful of your time and everybody's, and we've had such great conversations, and thankfully we will have another session with you where we can continue these talks. So I know you can go on and on all day because you're so passionate about this, but I know you have a zillion other things to do, and I know a number of our mentors and scholars need to jump off too. So I will plan to follow up with everyone with the materials that you sent out for us, and we'll also collect some feedback on what you thought today, and then we'll also plan we don't have a date yet, Jennifer, for the next one, right? So I think we're going to try to do it next month. So sometime in November or early December. So we'll be in touch about finding a date for us to convene and see what progress folks have made with their mentors. So thank you again, Richard. It's been such a great chat and great learning experience for all of us.
Yes, thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody. And have a great weekend. Do something nice for yourself.
Yes, you too.
That's the plan.
Thank you.
Is it Texas football this weekend? Is that what?
Yeah, but I might not want to watch it though. But we'll go for a bike ride. We'll do that. That's what we'll do.
That's a great one.
Focus on other things.
Excellent. So Richard, do you, Rich, I can call you Richard. Rich, do you tend to send out any kind of evaluation afterwards? I was going to just send out like a quick little form for feedback, but I don't know if you had something you like.
Yeah, you know, that would be great, because actually my last slide was going to be a mentee feedback form, but I didn't put it on there. So that would be great if you could do that. I would love to hear what people thought. Yeah, that would be really helpful, actually.
Is there anything in particular you want me to collect, or just sort of qualitative feedback about this?
I think qualitative. I mean, the chat was helpful. I mean, you were right. This is a group that was very engaged. Sometimes when you present, it's like just kind of quiet. They had good stuff. Philip brought it, right? So it's like we have moved in another gear. So I think the next conversation we have, I think we can really delve into the depth of cross-race, cross-identity mentoring. That's going to be super important, because I think, yeah, that was a very truthful and I think sometimes painful realization that that's how we navigate the space.
Yeah, and I was happy to see that the mentees weren't sort of intimidated, that they chimed in a lot with their ideas and thoughts. So that was really nice.
Yeah, it was. And I was glad to be in the space, because as I told Jennifer, I've been taking a beating this week. So it's like,
you deserved. Yeah.
I was like, why did I agree to do this? And
Oh, I know. I'm sure you thought about that.
Well, I was naive. I was like, oh, well, this sounds like a great idea. In fact, the president talked to me about doing this as a committee member. I'm like, sure. And he's like, well, you can chair it, right? And you know, every day I look at the Google News and, you know, diverse issues, this newspaper, that newspaper. I'm like, okay, you know, but, you know, the great thing is that things like this keep me focused on other things. Like I can't obsess over it. I have other things to do.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
I will. I teach today. That's going to be fun. And, you know, that is, again, it kind of brings you back to what we do. So.
Are you
great
in
group.
person or online? Teaching?
I'm online, and I'm having a good friend come do a guest lecture. He's a real troublemaker, so that'll be fun. You know, Thursday night classes are not the most, you know, I got to get them up for it. So he's going to come and be incredibly provocative, I'm sure. So that should be fun. Well, great. I will send you the slides because I'll have all of the responses that people gave to the interactive. So I'll get it to you right
Great.
away. And that way people can see what other people said.
That's great. Thank you.
Yes, y'all did great. Thank you so much for helping everything get set up.
Thank you.
Yeah, you did the
Okay.
hard part. So bye.
All right. See you. Thanks.
Take care.
Carrie, do you want to stay on for a sec?
Yeah. Do you want to stop the recording?
Oh, yes. Good idea.
I think I probably